Basketball Talk 77, and today's video is 3 NBA teams you've never heard of. Now, today, the NBA is in a state of stability. 30 teams, 15 teams in each conference, 2 conferences, Western Conference and Eastern Conference. However, it wasn't always like this, and it wasn't always this stable. Earlier times in the NBA, teams ran out of money and folded, their franchises just completely disappearing. Other times, when mergers happened between different basketball leagues, at least one of them having to be the NBA, teams changed names and locations, and therefore their old names and locations have been forgotten. However, this video serves to highlight 3 of these NBA teams that we've forgotten, whether it be because they changed name and location or whether they disappeared entirely. So, let's jump right in it with our first team, the Tri-Cities Blackhawks / Milwaukee Hawks. The Tri-Cities Blackhawks were a team that first existed in the NBL. Now, we have to say that, in fact, there used to be no NBA. Before 1949, the NBA did not exist, and it was just made up of multiple smaller leagues, most notably the NBL and BAA. The BAA is what would one day become the NBA, and that was the Basketball Association of America, and it included large cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. However, the NBL was more smaller cities in the Midwest, such as the Tri-Cities. The Tri-Cities were Moline, Illinois, Rock Island, Illinois, and Davenport, Iowa. Those were the 3 cities that made up the Tri-Cities. And they were called the Blackhawks because a war called the Black Hawk War was fought under the stadium in which they played. And so, they existed in the NBL for the first few years, until 1949, when the NBL and BAA merged to form the NBA we know today. It was mostly the BAA, but some NBL teams were allowed to come with them. Therefore, the Tri-Cities Blackhawks were one of these teams that were allowed to come. However, they didn't remain in the Tri-Cities for very long, as they only spent 2 seasons there, going not very well, and having horrible records, including 29-53, despite having Coach Red Auerbach, who one day became a legend coach in Boston. So, they didn't have much success, and by 1951, they decided to leave. And this is what a lot of teams did around that time, because all of these NBL teams that had come to the NBA were so small, or at least the cities they occupied were so small, that they simply couldn't keep up with those larger cities. And so this is what happened to the Tri-Cities, and therefore the franchise of the Blackhawks moved to the city of Milwaukee and became the Milwaukee Hawks. And the Milwaukee Hawks still didn't have much success. And for most of the time that they were there, all 4 seasons or all 4 years, they didn't do much, except for the last year where they acquired Bob Pettit, who was a future, maybe not a future Hall of Famer, but was definitely one of the greater talents of that era. And so, he would one day help the Hawks to a championship, but not under the name of Milwaukee, because after his rookie season in 1955, the Hawks decided to move again, and this time they moved to St. Louis, and this is where most people first hear of the Hawks. They won a championship in one of their first years there in 1958, and so that was where they stayed for a while until 1968, when they moved to Atlanta and became the Atlanta Hawks we know today. So they eventually had success in other areas. However, few people remember the days when the franchise of the Hawks was in the Tri-Cities and then Milwaukee. Our second team is the Philadelphia Warriors. And the Philadelphia Warriors were a different story than the Tri-Cities Blackhawks / Milwaukee Hawks. Because unlike the Tri-Cities, Philadelphia was a large city. And so they didn't have to move. And also, they were in the BAA originally, in the 1946-47 season, even before the merger where it became the NBA. And so, it's definitely a different story than the Tri-Cities Blackhawks. Anyway, the same thing happened. For the first few years, they had some success, but not enough to really win a championship or anything. And in 1949, the merger happened, and year after year, despite having great players, people who had the scoring title like Neil Johnston, Joe Fulks, and Paul Arizin, they were never able to really get a great record, and they were never able to win a championship in that time. In 1959, they acquired Wilt Chamberlain, and now this is one of the very best. This is one of the greats of the era of the 60s. And they began to get more success, better records. However, they still weren't able to win a championship. And then, in 1962, they decided to move. Or at least new ownership decided that they would move to San Francisco and become the San Francisco Warriors. Those same San Francisco Warriors were then renamed later on the Golden State Warriors, and they became the Golden State Warriors that we know today. But never in Philadelphia did they win a championship. And that's quite interesting because most people see the Philadelphia Warriors, or rather Wilt Chamberlain, as someone who played in Philadelphia early in his career, and they'd be right about that. However, a lot of people think that he played with the Philadelphia 76ers because they simply assume the 76ers were in Philadelphia at the time. And we'll get the 76ers backstory, their early teams, in a future video of the same kind. But actually, Wilt Chamberlain played for what is today the Golden State Warriors, not the Philadelphia 76ers, and few people know that. So that's an interesting little part of the history of the Philadelphia 76ers. And so, then we go on to our third team, the Chicago Stags. And this is different than the first two for an even bigger reason than any differences that we've covered so far. And this is because the Chicago Stags do not exist in any shape or form in the modern NBA, not even the franchise. They played their first few years in Chicago, in the BAA, and they even went to the 1947 finals, but they lost. And they were in the first. In 1949, they were part of the merger, and they, I believe, even made the 1950 finals, the first ever NBA finals. However, they lost the Minneapolis Lakers, and after that, they ran out of money and actually folded, which is essentially they stopped existing, and the team dispersed in the 1950 offseason. And so, unlike the other two teams where they have modern-day counterparts, the Atlanta Hawks and Golden State Warriors, there is no modern-day counterpart to the Chicago Stags. And so, there's an interesting what-if, because as they broke up and folded, they acquired Bob Cousy, and he would become a future great on the Celtics, and helped the Celtics win those 11 championships in the 60s and 50s. So it's an interesting what if. What if the Chicago Stags hadn't folded, hadn't ran out of money, and were able to continue as a franchise? Perhaps they could have won championships with Bob Cousy, and then they would have maybe been able to win titles, gain more financial success, and perhaps the Chicago Stags could be one of the 30 teams that exist in the NBA today, or at least one form of that team. So those are the 3 NBA teams for this video. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and if you want to see more of this, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many, many teams that you've probably never heard of, more than you'd think, and this could become a series. So, subscribe and turn on notifications if you enjoyed this, because there'll probably be future episodes. And so, also, if you actually have heard of one of these teams, leave it in the comments, because I highly doubt that one of you have heard of one of these NBA teams. But if you have, I'd like to know, because that would be cool. And perhaps how you heard of it. So anyway, that's all I have for today. Like, subscribe, and see you next time.